Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Start time, Neil was taking a short tour of the entire Microsoft campus. But he is here now in Microsoft Research, and what can I tell you about him before he comes up here and speaks, which I know is what you've been waiting for weeks and weeks. He's really a creepy individual. And even though he might be one of the 10 best postmodern writers on the planet today, that doesn't make him any less spooky. And maybe he's won every science fiction award and been nominated for all of them multiple times. And maybe he's written children's books and adult novels and screenplays and probably beautiful poetry, although I don't think he's actually ever published any of it. It doesn't make him less weird. So with that, please help me welcome the creepy, spooky, scary, weird Neil Gaiman.
So just recovering from a very lengthy attempt to persuade a secretary that I was not here to deliver a receptionist, I was not actually here to deliver a talk on internet security. It was actually getting to the point where she was starting to list off all of the 1:30 lectures, and I was ready to pick one. Yes, I know all about that. So, I like that. This is sort of a yin and yang thing, because when I was in San Francisco, I gave a talk at Google. Motto, do no evil. And now I'm here at Microsoft. Motto, we don't really have a problem with that whole evil thing. And thank you very much for having me. So, I was told that you don't like readings. Well, everyone's going, well, we like reading.
The same person. No one asked me.
You don't have a problem with readings? I mean, I'd love to read a little bit. What I thought I'd do, I can talk. This is Anansi Boys, and it's a new novel by me, and it's funny. Because I decided to add to the sum total of human happiness in the world. It was a plan. I thought, I wrote a big book. The last book was called American Gods, and it was really big and thick, and it won all sorts of awards, and it had made people think and all of that kind of thing. But I don't think anybody closed the book going, I just feel happier than I was when I started that book. So I thought I'd do this. And also there was another side to it, which is that once I'd written American Gods, people finally decided that they'd got a handle after all these years on how Terry Pratchett and I must have written Good Omens all those years ago, which is something that's apparently been puzzling people for years. And obviously, they figured what had happened was I wrote a very big, serious novel, and then Terry danced behind me like a little pixie, strewing jokes and funny footnotes through the text, turning it into something funny. So I thought, well, I'd like to write a funny book. So, and I had this story that had been knocking around in my head since about 1996. And actually, when I'd come to write American Gods, I'd borrowed a character from this book that I hadn't written yet. And I put him in, which was a very sweet little old man named Mr. Nancy. And this is a story about his son, Fat Charlie. He's not really, he's called Fat Charlie. That's not actually his name. His name is Charles Nancy. He's a very nice young man who has been embarrassed by his father over the years, and whose mother left his father when he was about 10 and went to England. And Fat Charlie's very happy with that. As far as he's concerned, 4,000 miles and the Atlantic Ocean are very good things to have between him and his father. And then his dad dies, and Fat Charlie goes to his father's funeral and winds up in a conversation with a little old lady named Mrs. Higgler. And I just thought I'd read you the conversation that he has with Mrs. Higgler. And he's talking about his father. He says, I don't think he ever did a day's work in all the time I knew him. She says, you shouldn't say that about your father. Well, it's true, he was crap. A rotten husband and a rotten father. Of course he was, said Mrs. Higgler fiercely. But you can't judge him like you would judge a man. You've got to remember, Fat Charlie, that your father was a god. A god among men? No, just a god. She said it without any kind of emphasis, as flatly and as normally as she might have said he was diabetic, or simply he was black. Fat Charlie wanted to make a joke of it, but there was that look in Mrs. Higgler's eyes, and suddenly he couldn't think of anything funny to say, so he said softly, he wasn't a god. Gods are special, mythical, they do miracles and things. That's right, said Mrs. Higgler. We wouldn't have told you when he was alive, but now he's gone, I can't see any harm in it. He was not a god, he was my dad. You can be both, she said, it happens. It was like arguing with a crazy person, thought Fat Charlie. He realized he should just shut up, but his mouth kept going. Right now his mouth was saying, look, if my dad was a god, he would have had godlike powers. He did. He never did a lot with them, mind you. But he was old. Anyway, how do you think he got away with not working? Whenever he needed money, he'd play the lottery or go down to Hollandale and bet on the dogs or the horses. Never win enough to attract attention, just enough to get by. Fat Charlie had never won anything in his whole life. Nothing whatsoever. In the various office sweepstakes he'd taken part in, he was only able to rely on his horse, never making it out of the starting gate, or his team being relegated to some hitherto unheard-of division somewhere in the elephant's graveyard of organized sport. It rankled. If my dad was a god, something which I do not for one moment concede in any way, I should add, then why aren't I a god too? I mean, you're saying I'm the son of a god, aren't you? Obviously. Well, then why can't I bet on winning horses or do magic or miracles or things? She sniffed. Your brother got all that god stuff. And that really is the beginning of Anansi Boys, and it's a story of what happens when Fat Charlie makes the mistake of inviting his brother, who is called Spider, into his life, and discovers that Spider is much better at his life than Fat Charlie ever was, and very rapidly has sort of taken everything over, including his fiancée. And it's what happens when Fat Charlie decides to get rid of his brother from his life, and then things get interesting. And it's a sort of a, what is it? It's a screwball romantic comedy, ghost, thriller, epic, family, detective. There's probably a few more genres in there. You know, it's one of those things. I have this theory that here in the early part of the 21st century, there are no more rules of genre anymore other than as marketing hints for people walking into bookshops as to what part of the bookshop they probably don't want to go into. You know, I don't even think they're useful for what part of the bookshop you do want to go into, but it's more like, you know that if you don't want books on fishing, you just won't go into the fishing section. Or cowboy books, or romances, or whatever it happens that you don't like. So with Anansi Boys, it'll probably get filed in science fiction and fantasy if it doesn't get filed in literature. And I don't care, because it went straight in on the New York Times bestseller list at #1. Which is actually what I thought I was going to talk about. Because I'm absolutely fascinated by how it did and why it did. And what that says about the wired world and the wireless world that we're living in today. The problem with book publishing is fundamentally one of budget for advertising. If you look at how much Hollywood spends just to let you know that a new movie is coming out, or somebody will spend to let you know that a new chocolate bar exists, and then you suddenly strip that back and you go, how do you find out that a new book is out there? And you realize why so many authors grumble about the fact that they aren't getting the kind of advertising that they'd like, and they aren't really getting any advertising at all. And I sort of solved that problem with this book in a very odd and upside-down way, completely accidentally, in February 2001. And that just sort of began as a weird little offshoot of the fact that when I joined CompuServe in 1989 in the UK, there was a science fiction forum and a comics forum, and I'd go on and post and just sort of chat. And when I moved out to America and discovered Genie, and if you were a science fiction writer, you got free Genie memberships. I had my own little Genie topic, and we'd just sort of go on there and burble on a more or less daily basis. And then Genie disappeared, and there was the Well for a bit, and I just sort of did the Well for a bit and burbled on a daily basis. And then, around about 2001, I finished American Gods, and there was this thing called blogging. And I thought, and I talked to my editor, I said, I'd really love to blog about what happens between me typing the words "the end" and the book coming out, and the author tour. Because that's the stuff nobody ever tells you. On a movie, you see an author, you type the word "the end," the screen goes, and then best-selling book. And it's as if nothing happened. But that's where an awful lot of interesting thing happens. And some of it's really odd, like, you know, the nightmare that involves trying to get permissions for song quotes and things, and which range from the incredibly pleasant gentleman named Greg Brown, who's a wonderful singer-songwriter, whose fee for quoting a verse of a song of his in American Gods was a nice sushi dinner. All the way through to the people who own the rights to the song Unforgettable, who, if I had actually quoted "Unforgettable, that's what you are," unforgettable, that's what you are, 6 words, they wanted $7,000 for it. So I paraphrased. But you tell them all that kind of cool stuff and what happens. And I did my blog, and I chatted, and it was incredibly fun, and I got to write these little mini essays on the book production process. And by the time the book had come out, and it did very well, I looked around and I had 20,000 people reading my blog. I thought, this is really cool. I've never had 20,000 people just sort of regularly coming in. There are magazines out there that don't have 20,000 circulation. This is cool. I like this. So I carried on. And it was very much for me the same kind of thing that I've been doing on CompuServe and Genie and the Well over the years. And I'd answer questions, and I'd just burble, and I'd clean, And I also liked the idea of communicating the fact that a working author is somebody who sits there and puts one word after another. In the case of most novels, about 100,000 times. And that seemed like an important thing to tell people, because otherwise they think that you just sort of swan around mystically, waiting for inspiration. And then you're sort of enveloped by a glow. And when the glow goes away, you're holding the book. And I like the idea of just sort of talking about what it was like, so I did. And currently the blog has 1.2 million individual visitors, which obviously doesn't quite work out probably at 1.2 million people, because you can assume a few people are doing it from different computers. But then there are probably some people out there who are doing it on somebody else's computer, and maybe it all works out. I don't know. But it's the best guess we have. And what that meant was that there were an awful lot of people out there waiting for Anansi Boys. And they all went out and bought it in the first week. And communicating to 1.2 million people who would like to have bought the book anyway, that the book was around and out there, was really what the blog did. But it was a side effect. It wasn't created as this brilliant commercial thing that I will do this and then we will get this kind of result. It was something I would have done anyway. But, they came out and they told each other about it. And suddenly, Dan Brown was ground beneath my heel. Oh, he will be back. It will be like... I think he's been ground beneath lots of heels, and he always comes back. That book's sort of turned into the pet rock. But So anyway, that was so, and that's the bit that actually completely fascinates me, is that we managed to sidestep somehow all of the traditional rules about what you can do, simply by having direct access to everybody, more or less a one-on-one access. The downside to it is also the weird upside to doing the signing tour, which is authors doing successful signing tours get about 150 to 200 people at their signings. And this is great. You can sign for 150 to 200 people. You can feel like you've done a good evening's work, and you can still go and get dinner. And I'm getting 700 or 800 people because they've read about it on the blog. And I stumble, dazed, out of there at 1 o'clock in the morning with my hand hurting, all ready for the 6 a.m. pickup to take me to the next city. Which gives you a very, very strange perspective on book touring. And now I'm having to, I'm now in this position where I'm going, okay, I don't think I can do another book tour. I don't think this works anymore. The paradigm breaks at those numbers. But I also don't want to cut things off, because it's really one of the things that's always been important for me, is going out there and meeting people and having some kind of personal contact. So I'm now sort of figuring out ways to maybe do reading tours or something like that, which I did some years ago, did fairly successfully in the 90s for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is a First Amendment organization. And I think I'll probably do that next, because I can't figure out another way to get it to work and still to be on the road. Let's see. I suppose for those of you who are sitting here because somebody else told you that you should come along, I should probably tell you who I am and what I do, apart from somebody who just wrote an Anansi Boys book. I started out writing comics. Actually, I started out as a journalist, fled that and began writing comics. Wrote a comic called Sandman, which was highly acclaimed, as these things go. And in a world in which comics simply aren't acclaimed at all in any way, highly or not, was actually kind of cool. And when I finished Sandman, which was about 10 volumes and 2,000 pages, I then decided to try and teach myself how to write novels properly. So I've been doing a few of those. And more recently, I've been doing some movies. Last week, a movie called Mirrormask premiered, which is one that it's a Dave McKean movie. Dave McKean's an artist that I've worked with for years, and I got called by Lisa Henson at the Henson Company, and she said, we want to make a film like Labyrinth. We like those 80s films that Jim Henson made, the fantasy films. They cost $40 million back then. We have $4 million now. But she'd seen the films that Dave McKean had made, quite literally, in his mum's barn, for quite literally nothing. And she said, do you think he'd be interested in making a film? And I said, I don't know, but I can ask him. So we asked him, and he was. And I wrote the film with Dave, but it's very much Dave's film. I was more or less the hands and doing the dialogue, and mostly because I had no idea how you could do this. And all I knew was all of the rules didn't work that I did know from writing movies. I'd say, okay, so we need a scene in her school, and Dave would go, no, we can't do it, we can't afford it. And I go, well, why not? And he'd say, well, we'd need at least 7 kids, we need chaperones, we need a space, we need this, and then he'd see my face and he'd say, but look, if you need the world to crumple up like a piece of paper and then reform into a flower, I could do that for nothing. So we made Mirrormask, which is a sort of labyrinthy kind of film. And we made it for $4 million, which was less than it was when we started out, because the dollar collapsed. So it was we were making it in London, it was £2.5 million on the first day of shooting. And then as soon as they needed the money, it was £2 million. And £500,000 had gone away. And Dave made it by hiring 15 kids from Bournemouth College of Art, the graduating class of the Computer Art College. So it wasn't just their first film, it was their first job. But he figured that way they'd be up to date on the technology and have nothing to unlearn. And indeed, that was really how it worked. And so I'm doing that. And I'm also at the other end of the spectrum. Last Monday, they started shooting a film that I wrote with director Roger Avery of Beowulf. And it's using that Polar Express-y kind of technique. The way that director Bob Zemeckis explained it to me, he said, well, Polar Express was the 1.0, and this is our 3.0. I think a film called Monster House will be their 2.0. And he said, we think we've got, the bugs out. We figured out how to make eyes work. We figured out all of this stuff. And they really wanted it to be a film for adults. Polar Express was very much a kid's film using that animated technique. So this is Beowulf, and it's filled with blood and gore and sex and lots and lots and lots and lots of mead. Possibly less mead than when Roger and I wrote it for Roger to direct. Roger did Pulp Fiction and Killing Zoe and Rules of Attraction. And there was really going to be, this was going to be a major mead film at that point. But the strange thing was then having to rewrite the script for a limitless budget. We had a fairly perfunctory dragon battle in the end. For those of you for whom it's been a long time since you read Beowulf, or who slept through that bit, he dies at the end. I hope I'm not giving too much away. 50 years after most of the action in battle with the dragon. And we had a fairly perfunctory dragon battle. Now we have the biggest, best, most serious one man fighting something that's rather like an animated jet plane / lorry that's trying to destroy him. And and there was a point in there where I phoned Bob Zemeckis. I said, well, I'm working on this thing, but I worry about our budget. And he said, Neil, there's nothing you could possibly write that would cost us more than $1 million a minute to shoot. And I realized that once again, all the rules had changed. So, and that, for those of you who haven't been following the papers, it started they started capturing the performances last week. It's not really shooting because that's not quite how it works. But the performances are being input. And then they will be extruded again, I imagine, at some point. Or possibly exhumed. And we have Anthony Hopkins as Hrothgar, John Malkovich as Unferth, Beowulf is Ray Winston, Wiglaf is Brendan Gleeson, Weltho is Robin Penwright, Crispin Glover plays Grendel, and in a fit of typecasting, we have Angelina Jolie as his mum. So there we go. Right, what would you like to know? We can do a little Q&A stuff. If you have any Qs, I can do some As. Yes?
Is there any truth to rumors that I've been hearing that Miracle Man
May Miracle Man someday be finished? Yes, I believe. We're hoping for it. We were doing very, very well on the sorting things out a bit at a time on the Miracle Man front. For those of you who don't know, it is simply too long a story. Trust me on this. If I were going to do any justice at all, we would be here until 6. So, old comic character, copyright can of worms, something that I worked on years ago that I would very much like to finish. The specifics of why it is now, we were doing very well unpiecing and untangling it a bit at a time, and then Todd McFarlane Productions, who were claiming a trademark on Miracle Man, as far as we're concerned, fraudulently, then went into bankruptcy. And when things hit bankruptcy courts, they get weirder and stickier, and all of the rules change, and so on and so forth. So right now, there are weird, sticky things where all of the rules have changed, and it's all Todd in bankruptcy, and we have to sort of either get him out or sort it out or whatever. Yes?
This question but for your work in Babylon 5 with JMS and Day of the Dead, great story, by the way.
Thank you.
2 questions. What was your thinking behind the transportation of the souls into that different plane? And the second part is, for Rebo and Zudi, was there any relationship between them and Vandemar and crew?
Oh. No. On the second part, no relationship between Valdemar and Krupp and Rebo and Zuti. I just loved the fact that it was a joke that Joe Straczynski had made, several seasons before, that the humor of Rebo and Zuti was something that most aliens didn't get. And I loved the idea of bringing on some aliens and then trying to make it so that their humor would be something that people now wouldn't get. Much in the same way that trying to watch old Steve Martin routines is really weird now, because they were incredibly funny in 1974, but you can't remember why it was. It's really weird. You buy a Steve Martin comedy album, put it on, and prepare to be amused. And you're going, no, it was funny. I practically wet myself. He said, "Excuse me." It was so cool. So we're trying to do that, but for 300 years in the future. How did Babylon... The other bit, Babylon 5, actually very appropriately for today, was the idea... one of the things I love doing in fantasy is simply taking a metaphor and making it real, and seeing where metaphors break down and where you can look at things very literally. And there was a lot of argument at the time that I wrote that. I'd just come back from England, and I'd been reading the papers, and they were arguing about the concept of an Erev in England, which was in sort of North London, which was this Jewish... There's lots of really cool, weird little Jewish rules. And one of them is the definition of what you can do inside and outside your house on the Sabbath. But if you can somehow redefine a large enough area as your house, then you're allowed to do the second set of rules rather than the first set of rules. I'm probably saying this all wrong. So there was all this argument about technical, people stringing bits of string from one telephone wire to another in order to link this thing and make it contiguous. And I thought, well, what if somebody bought an area of Babylon 5 and said, oh no, this will be part of our home planet for the night. And everybody's going, oh, haha, yes, this is an alien religious ritual. And they suddenly find out, no, it's actually true. But just for that night. So that was really, one of the starting points. Plus, I just like dead people. Everything she said about the creepy stuff is actually true. And it seemed like a fun way to tell a story. And I was desperate to try and write an episode of Babylon 5 before the end of the 5th series, because there was never going to be a 6th. So, yep.
Talk about switching from writing comics, write a novel properly. What's the difference? Can you talk a little bit about it?
They're all different. And what actually fascinates me is that most people don't do what I do, which is madly butterfly from one medium to another, more or less abandoning anything I can do reasonably competently for something that I have no idea what I'm doing in, and being completely prepared to make a fool of myself and to learn on the job. Maybe it's just I have a short attention span, although I did do Sandman for 10 years, so probably not. But I do, given a choice between... the question I get asked most often on this particular tour, for some reason, is when are you going to do a Neverwhere sequel? And I keep saying, well, there is a bunch of Neverwhere sequel that I've plotted, but given the choice between writing a Neverwhere sequel and doing something that I don't know how to do, I will go and try and do the thing I don't know how to do, because that's more interesting, and I'll learn more. With comics, you learn very rapidly that you have a whole set of superpowers that people who write novels wish they could have. For example, you can give people pictures. Everybody reading Sandman knew what the character of Dream looked like. You can control how they read, beat by beat, moment by moment, in a way that I can't. In Anansi Boys, you may be enjoying it no end, but if your eye hits a long passage of description, it may very well just sort of skid down the page to the next place that somebody says something and miss something kind of fun and important. Whereas in comics, I can make sure you read every word. I'm laying them out on the page. I'm controlling when you turn the page. On the other hand, on the other hand, a novel goes straight in through the eyes and starts messing around at the back of your head. And that in itself is a strength. You can digress in ways you couldn't digress in a comic. You can build things you can't build in a comic, because the reader is playing a much more active part. But you can also do really fun things, like not tell somebody what somebody looks like. You can mess around with somebody's head sometimes in a novel, in prose, in ways that you couldn't in comics, where everything's very visual. And I enjoy doing that. I like sneaking. I like the fact I can make readers work harder if they're willing to play. So you can do that. In movies are probably the easiest in some ways and the hardest in other ways to write, because at least in comics, when you're writing a comic script, you're being the editor and you're being the director. And you're writing a letter to the artist that is basically just page 1, panel 1, this is what you're doing. And beat by beat, frame by frame, telling them what to do. But directors don't like that. So, of movies. So you tend to leave it with just sort of roughly what's happening in the action. And actually that was one of the fun things about doing Beowulf, which was Bob Zemeckis loved it. He kept encouraging us to please put in funky camera movements into the script, which you're always told not to do. And of course, because this is mocap, motion capture, and then animated, they were all impossible camera movements, which was also enormously fun. So, we start up with a close-up on somebody's eyeball, and then we pull back until we're in the fireplace, and then we shoot up the chimney and can keep pulling back into an aerial shot. You're going, couldn't do that in real life. That was fun. But most directors frown on this. And, yes. Okay, probably last question, and both hands went up simultaneously, so last 2 questions. Yes.
So you mentioned in Anansi Boys the 2 words family mystery right next to each other. And I'm thinking back and I'm thinking Sandman, that was one of the big storylines. Mr. Punch, Violent Cases. Is family mystery the big thing in this world?
Oh, I think it's definitely one of them. I had this marvelous experience giving a talk much like this. Actually, it was an interview at the West Hollywood Book Fair on Sunday. And I was interviewed, and as I came off the stage, a very, very elderly gentleman in a hat approached me. And he said, "Excuse me, you won't know who I am." But I just had to really hear the voice, and I did. And I said, "You're Aubrey Morris." Now, Aubrey Morris, if you go and IMDb him, and you look at some pictures, you'll go, "Oh, him." Because Aubrey Morris dies fairly painfully in Act 2 of practically everything made in England between 1964 and 1974. He dies painfully in Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. He's what else is he? He's the probation officer in Clockwork Orange and things like that. Oh, actually, the one that all of you will go, "Oh, him," is he was the captain of the Golga French and Bee Ark in the bath with his rubber duck in the Hitchhiker's TV show. Everybody goes, "Yes." And so he comes up to me and he says, "My boy," he says, I have to tell you, you reminded me up there on that stage so much of your grandfather. You have to know that my father and your grandfather were the best of friends. They were the best of friends." He said, "I need you to come back to Hollywood. You have to come over to my place because I have to tell you about your family. I have to tell you about your grandfather's generation. There's stuff that only I know, that nobody else knows." And then he said, "I know the dark things." And there's something about being told by Aubrey Morris in this amazing resonant voice that he knows the dark things. So I'm definitely going back there. I want to find out all the dark things. And I phoned my dad and I said, "Hey, Dad, I'm going to learn all the dark things." He said, "It's Aubrey Morris." He said, "They may not be true." I said, "Oh, that's not the point," I said. And you had your hand up.
That doesn't happen to anyone else. I just wanted to know something about the mechanics of your writing. Do you plot everything out in advance? Do you use index cards to keep plot points together.
Oh no, I'm crap at all that stuff. The index cards and the plotting things out, and I have done it once. I did it many years ago with Black Orchid for DC Comics, and I wrote Black Orchid. I wrote a very, very, very detailed outline because nobody was going to let me do it unless I did, and I wrote the thing to the very, very detailed outline, and it was kind of like reconstituting a dehydrated meal. As a writer, there wasn't any room to create anything. And I loathed it. So more or less since then, I tend to have a fairly loose approach to plotting, in that I know kind of what I'm doing. But it's the kind of what you're doing if you know that you're starting out in Seattle and you're going to drive to New York in an old car, and where you're probably going to stop on the way. But you don't know everything that's going to happen. You don't know whether the car's going to die on you. And you don't know what's going to happen with that hitchhiker. And so you try and put that stuff in, and that makes it interesting. With Anansi Boys, it went great, making it up, with a sort of general plan, until I got halfway through, and then something unexpected happened. And I stopped for 4 months. Because either I could throw out those last 2 pages in which something really interesting but unexpected happened that shocked even me, or I could keep them and keep going. But that had to change. Then everything had to change. It had to get deeper and odder and darker. And I liked the idea of the latter, but it took me 4 months of walking around, walking into walls, having the kind of conversations with my assistant where she'd come over and say, "I've put a cup of tea in front of you." And I'd go, "Great. Is there any chance of a cup of tea?" So, because all of my head was off somewhere working on the back of, figuring it all out.
So that doesn't lead you astray. Sometimes you don't end up going down a long path.
Very rarely. I love writing in longhand. Writing in longhand, I think, is a marvelous thing to do for a writer these days, because if you have a notebook and a nice pen, you can go off somewhere, you can write, it's solar powered. You can drop it or get it wet, and pretty much all of your work will continue to be there. And if you suddenly decide to look up a word or check a reference, you will not look up 4 hours later blinking, finding yourself somehow in the middle of an eBay auction that you never had any plans to be part of. Also, nobody can pop up messages to you on the screen while you're working. Not yet on pieces of paper. If any of you are planning to go down that route, please don't. I suppose somebody could run over and put a Post-it note down. But so I love that. And then when I get to second draft, and I love the discontinuity of an actual first and an actual second draft. The problem I find with computers for me is I just get a rolling, improving first draft. But there is no discontinuity. On the other hand, I always use computers for screenplays, because I love Final Draft, and it formats everything for me, and it makes me feel like the computer's actually doing some of the work, which is such a marvelous feeling, that I'm very happy to do that. And I think, time-wise, I now have to start scribbling on stuff. Thank you all for being so patient.